Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The morning of December 19th, 2024, rose gently over Abuja, with the sun sliding across the skyline as if reluctant to show its full face. Oluchi had woken early that day, her heart heavy with questions that had no answers, yet her spirit light with curiosity. She had promised her pastor she would not turn down the meeting, though in truth she was not sure she had the strength to open her heart again. The church service had just ended, worshippers still loitering in small groups, exchanging pleasantries, while some hurried to beat the traffic of the city. Abuja was always restless, a place where ambition and survival lived side by side, but within the quiet corner of the church compound, time seemed to slow down. The pastor, a man known for his booming laughter and habit of connecting people, called her aside with a knowing smile. "Oluchi," he said, "I want you to meet someone. He is older, calm, and maybe the kind of man your heart has been searching for." She followed, not out of eagerness but out of courtesy, as though her legs belonged to duty rather than desire. The man stood by the doorway, tall, lean, his eyes carrying a mixture of nervousness and pride. His name was Emma. At that moment, the world did not stop spinning, no music floated in her ears, and no strange butterflies fluttered in her belly. But there was a pause, the kind of pause that leaves you wondering later if fate had just placed a seed in your hand. Emma's greeting was gentle, his smile guarded, as though he feared being measured too quickly. He extended his hand, and Oluchi noticed the roughness of his palm, the kind that spoke of work done honestly, but without luxury. Their pastor, satisfied that the introduction was complete, left them to themselves, his robe sweeping the floor as he hurried to another conversation. Emma spoke a little, his words soft, his sentences short, as if English was a garment he was still learning to wear. Oluchi listened with quiet patience, nodding, smiling faintly, trying to draw him out. She felt neither excitement nor disappointment, just curiosity. They did not linger long, for the church compound was still bustling with chatter and movement. Before parting, Emma asked for her number, his voice betraying a mixture of hope and hesitation. She gave it freely, not because she had been swept off her feet, but because her spirit whispered that sometimes stories begin with very small gestures. As she walked back toward the car park, the slip of paper in his hand seemed unimportant. Yet in truth, it was the thread that would later pull her life into a weave of emotions she could not yet imagine. Life often hides its biggest storms in the smallest clouds, and Oluchi, unaware of the road ahead, only saw a man who seemed eager to be known. That evening, back in her modest Abuja apartment, Oluchi thought briefly of the man she had met. She had work reports spread across her table, a plate of untouched food by her side, and the hum of the city outside her window. She told herself it was only an introduction, nothing more, nothing less. But her phone buzzed, and his name appeared. "Emma." She hesitated, then answered, and his voice came through the line, carrying both nervousness and relief. They spoke in fragments, like two strangers trying to bridge a river with pieces of wood. He asked about her work, and she answered carefully, not wishing to sound boastful. She asked about his own, and he spoke with pride, though the details were thin, and she could sense gaps in his explanations. The call was short, but something about it lingered. It was not romance, not even friendship yet, but the faint stirrings of possibility. Oluchi told herself that love was not always fireworks. Sometimes it was a seed buried deep, waiting for rain. That night she lay awake, the December harmattan breeze sneaking through her window, and wondered if she was standing at the threshold of something fragile yet powerful. The following days rolled into one another, and their calls stretched longer each time. Emma's voice became a familiar sound, like a song half learned but hummed with growing comfort. He was older, calmer in speech, though often clumsy in his choice of words. Oluchi sometimes laughed softly at his errors, correcting him gently, not to mock but to guide. She sensed he did not always enjoy being corrected, but she brushed it aside, telling herself that patience could polish rough edges. By the time Christmas drew near, their conversations had become daily rituals. Emma suggested they meet again, this time outside Abuja, in Lagos where Oluchi planned to spend the holidays. The idea felt bold, almost too soon, but her heart agreed. She told herself that distance was no wall for two people willing to reach across it. In those moments, she clung to hope the way a child clings to a toy, innocent, trusting, unprepared for disappointment. And so it was settled. Lagos would be their next meeting ground, a city alive with noise, colors, and countless stories, ready to witness theirs unfold. Oluchi arrived in Lagos 2 days before Christmas, the city already swollen with travelers returning home, horns blaring, traders shouting, the air thick with fried food and festive cheer. She had grown used to the controlled pulse of Abuja, but Lagos was different. It was a storm in daylight, a place where patience often ran out before the traffic lights turned green. Still, there was something intoxicating about the energy, and as her cousin's car crawled past the crowded bus stops and roadside stalls, Oluchi felt herself pulled into the rhythm of the city. She had agreed to meet Emma in a small restaurant tucked into one of the quieter corners of Surulere, and though her heart was steady, her mind kept replaying their conversations of the past week. What if this meeting shattered the fragile hope she had been nursing? What if he wasn't the man her imagination had painted in soft strokes? By the time she dressed for the evening, choosing a modest yet elegant gown, she had rehearsed countless scenarios in her head. Lagos nights carried their own magic. They could turn disappointment into a story or joy into a memory worth keeping. When she arrived, the restaurant was buzzing with families, couples, and friends. She found a table near the window, the lights from the street spilling in like restless spirits. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and just as she began to wonder if he would show, Emma appeared, walking toward her with a faint smile that seemed to hide more than it revealed. The first thing Oluchi noticed was his clothes. His shirt hung too loosely, as though borrowed from a neighbor, and his trousers seemed to fight against his frame. His shoes, though polished, had seen better days. She felt her heart dip slightly, not because of the fabric on his back, but because it spoke of a man who paid little attention to the details that matter when meeting someone important. Yet she reminded herself that outward appearance is only a shadow of the true person, and shadows can be misleading. When he sat down across from her, his eyes bright with expectation, she decided to set aside her judgment and focus on the man himself. They exchanged greetings, polite words that felt heavier than they should have, and the waiter came to take their orders. Emma's voice was calm but carried an awkward rhythm, sentences tumbling over each other, tenses colliding like careless dancers. At first Oluchi listened without interrupting, but when his mistakes grew too obvious, she corrected him gently, her tone soft, her smile assuring. She wanted him to know she was not laughing at him, only helping. But as the conversation wore on, Emma's brows furrowed, his smile thinning each time she corrected him. Finally, he leaned back and said, "Since you understand me, why keep correcting me?" The words landed like a stone dropped in water, sending ripples through her heart. She looked into his face and saw not gratitude but irritation. In that moment, she realized that kindness could sometimes be mistaken for insult, and pride could wear the face of sensitivity. They ate in silence for a while, though silence in Lagos is never complete. The restaurant echoed with laughter, plates clattering, waiters rushing, and outside the street buzzed with impatient drivers honking as if noise could move traffic. Oluchi chewed slowly, her mind searching for ways to rescue the evening from slipping into awkwardness. She asked him about his journey from Ibadan, and he spoke with pride about enduring the long hours on the road just to see her. That softened her heart slightly, reminding her that effort is a form of affection. He spoke about his work, though the details remained sketchy, and when she pressed, he gave vague answers, always returning to how difficult life could be in a city like Lagos. She nodded, listening, though inside she wondered why a man of his age seemed so unwilling to embrace challenge. But she hid her thoughts, smiling when required, laughing softly at his jokes, even when they missed their mark. As the evening stretched on, she found herself caught between gratitude for his presence and unease at the cracks already showing. She wanted to believe those cracks could be mended, that patience could fill the gaps, that love could be taught like a language learned slowly over time. Yet a small voice inside her whispered, "Beware of a roof that leaks even before the rain begins." When they finally stepped out into the cool December night, Lagos embraced them with its restless energy. Street vendors shouting, music blasting from nearby bars, headlights flashing like restless fireflies. Emma walked beside her, his stride relaxed, his face carrying the calmness of a man who believed the evening had gone well enough. Oluchi, however, carried a different weight. She smiled politely, spoke gently, and even thanked him for making the journey, but inside she felt the stirrings of unease, like a traveler sensing that the road ahead may not be as smooth as it appears. He escorted her to her cousin's car, his farewell brief, his handshake firm, his eyes betraying no hint of doubt. As the car pulled away, Oluchi leaned against the seat, staring out at the endless Lagos lights, her thoughts tangled like the city's traffic. She told herself it was too early to judge, that first impressions can mislead, that patience was a virtue she had promised herself to uphold. Yet she could not shake off the memory of his frown when she tried to help, nor the careless way he had dressed for their first true meeting. Love, she knew, was not about clothes or perfect grammar, but she also knew that pride and indifference could choke the sweetest seed before it had the chance to grow. The weeks after Lagos felt like a tug of war inside Oluchi's chest. Each evening when she returned to her Abuja apartment, she would drop her handbag on the chair, kick off her shoes, and stare at her phone, knowing his call would come soon. Emma had made it a habit to ring her daily, his voice filling the silence of her small living room. At first, she welcomed the attention. It was comforting to know someone was waiting to hear her speak, someone who asked how her day went, even if the questions lacked depth. But as the calls stretched, she began to notice something gnawed quietly at the edges of her patience. His words often stumbled over each other, his stories thin, his thoughts fixed on routines that felt too small for her restless spirit. Still, she laughed when he tried to sound witty, and she listened when he shared small victories, like finishing a task early or visiting a friend. She wanted to nurture what was there, even if it felt fragile, even if a part of her whispered that it was like watering dry sand. Each night she told herself love required endurance, that bonds did not grow overnight, that what seemed shallow could, in time, deepen into something stronger. And so she endured, holding on to the possibility that their rough edges would smooth out if rubbed long enough together. Yet in the quiet moments, when she put down the phone and the room fell back into silence, she would sit by the window, watching the city lights, and wonder if she was building a home out of straw in a season of rain. It was during one of those conversations that Emma mentioned marriage in a tone that startled her. She had been expecting words of dreams, plans for their future, or at least a hint of excitement at the thought of union. Instead, he spoke as if marriage was no more than a simple errand, a task to be ticked off a list. "I don't see the need for all those church ceremonies," he said, his voice steady, almost casual. "We just need to buy the traditional items, take them to your family, and that is enough. Why waste money on white weddings?" Oluchi sat still, her hand tightening around her phone, her breath caught between disbelief and disappointment. To her, marriage had always been a covenant, a celebration of two lives choosing each other, a moment that carried meaning beyond the exchange of gifts. She tried to explain gently that it was not about extravagance, that it was about honor and testimony, but Emma brushed her words aside as though she were exaggerating. "As long as our parents bless it, nothing else matters," he insisted. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of Abuja's late traffic outside. She imagined herself standing beside him, not in a hall filled with family and friends, but in a quiet room with no witnesses, no joy, just an exchange of items. The picture unsettled her deeply. She knew compromise was part of love, but she also knew compromise should not erase the core of one's desires. His words replayed over and over, and she realized that for Emma, convenience was more important than meaning. As weeks turned into months, the cracks widened. Oluchi noticed that Emma was not only resistant to change, but almost allergic to it. When she suggested he might transfer his job from Ibadan to Lagos for better opportunities, his answer was sharp and final. "I don't want that kind of life," he said. "In Lagos, people wake up at 5 a.m. just to chase buses and come home at night like broken machines. I prefer my peace here." Oluchi wanted to respect his choice, but she could not ignore the truth. Ambition was a language he did not speak. She thought of her own days, rising early, pushing through the bustle of Abuja, striving to make her mark in real estate even when her salary was modest. She had learned that struggle was part of growth, that no harvest came without sweat, but Emma seemed content to stay in one place, untouched by the demands of the world. She tried not to let frustration seep into her voice during their calls, but sometimes silence stretched too long, her heart caught between admiration for his calm and disappointment at his lack of drive. Friends noticed her unease and asked subtle questions. One evening, a close colleague, Ada, looked at her and said, "You are building dreams, Oluchi. Are you sure he is not just building excuses?" Oluchi laughed it off, but the words struck her deeply. She knew Ada was right, but she still held on, convinced that if she left too soon, she might be walking away from a blessing disguised as imperfection. By the time March rolled around, her patience was stretched thin, though she hid it well. Emma remained steady in his ways, unwilling to bend, unwilling to accept even the smallest corrections or suggestions. If she mentioned an error in his speech, he would withdraw, his voice tight with wounded pride. If she proposed an idea about the future, he would dismiss it, preferring his own comfort. It was as though he lived inside a circle and refused to step out, no matter how inviting the world beyond looked. Oluchi found herself speaking less during their calls, letting him fill the space with stories that looped around the same points. She longed for conversations that lifted her spirit, words that inspired, plans that stretched beyond the present, but each day it became clearer that Emma's horizon was a narrow one. Yet she kept silent, waiting, hoping, convincing herself that change could come slowly. Deep inside, however, her heart was beginning to prepare for the truth, that perhaps she was holding onto a rope that was fraying in her hands. The idea frightened her, because it meant admitting that all her patience, her laughter, her gentle corrections, had been like rain falling on stone, heard but never absorbed. April crept in with the slow rhythm of dusty winds and restless afternoons, and with it came Oluchi's decision to see Emma's life up close. Their calls had begun to feel like words spoken into a hollow chamber. Responses echoed back, but nothing new was born. She told herself that perhaps distance had blurred her judgment, that maybe if she saw the world he lived in, the corners of his daily existence, she would understand him better. So she applied for a few days' leave from her real estate firm, packed a modest bag, and boarded a bus from Abuja to Ibadan. The road stretched endlessly, filled with the scent of roasted corn and the sounds of hawkers shouting prices at bus stops. Oluchi sat by the window, her mind heavy with questions she couldn't share with anyone. She thought of Emma's voice on the phone, calm but often lacking fire, and wondered if the man behind that voice might show her a side she had missed. Her heart carried both dread and hope, like a traveler carrying both umbrella and sunglasses, unsure what weather awaited at the destination. As the bus rolled past towns and villages, children chasing after tires, old women sitting by roadside stalls, she whispered prayers under her breath, asking for clarity. She believed this trip would be the turning point, either to bind her closer to him, or to free her from the threads she was unwilling to name as chains. When she finally arrived in Ibadan, Emma was waiting at the park, his face bright with welcome, though his clothes were once again a mismatch of colors and sizes. He led her through the bustling streets, past traders selling plantain and yams, taxis honking impatiently, the city alive but less hurried than Abuja or Lagos. His stride was casual, his words simple, and she tried to focus on his effort rather than his flaws. They reached his neighborhood, a cluster of modest houses tucked into a street where goats roamed freely and children played barefoot. Oluchi's heart tightened as they approached his home. She had imagined a space, however small, that carried the pride of a man preparing to host a woman he claimed to love. Instead, the sight that greeted her was disheartening. The yard was scattered with plastic bottles, the steps coated in dust, and weeds growing freely in corners. Inside, the air was thick with the stale smell of food left too long. Plates sat unwashed, clothes lay crumpled in heaps, and the bed, meant to welcome her, looked as though it had not been touched in days. She forced a smile as Emma showed her around, his tone casual, as though he saw nothing wrong. Oluchi nodded politely, but inside her heart sank lower than words could describe. For her, cleanliness was not about wealth, it was about respect. And she could not understand how a man who knew she was coming could leave his world so untended. That evening, as the sun dipped behind Ibadan's hills and the city settled into its slower rhythm, they sat in his small sitting room, sharing a meal he had ordered rather than cooked. Oluchi ate quietly, her spoon clinking against the plate, while Emma spoke in his usual tone, weaving stories of his job, of old friends, of memories that seemed to matter more to him than the present moment. She tried to listen, tried to draw warmth from his presence, but all she felt was an unsettling emptiness. Every glance around the room reminded her of his carelessness, the dusty shelves, the cobwebs tucked into corners, the water-stained ceiling. She realized that what unsettled her most was not the dirt itself, but the indifference it revealed. If he could not tidy his world to welcome her, what effort would he make for the life they might build together? His laughter echoed, unaware of her silence, and she smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. As night thickened, she excused herself to rest, lying on his unmade bed, staring at the ceiling as if answers could be found in its cracks. Sleep evaded her. Instead, questions danced around her head. Could love survive in a place where care was absent, where effort seemed like a burden rather than a natural act? She turned from side to side, but the answers never came, only the certainty that her heart was growing weary. By dawn, her decision was quiet but firm. She rose before Emma stirred, the house still cloaked in early morning silence. She folded her few clothes into her bag, washed her face quickly, and stepped outside, breathing in the fresh Abaddon air as though cleansing herself of the staleness within. Emma joined her shortly after, smiling, unaware of the storm raging inside her. He walked her to the bus park, speaking lightly about when next she might return, his voice filled with expectation. Oluchi nodded politely, her face calm, but her mind was already far away. She boarded the bus, waved briefly, and turned her gaze out of the window, watching as the city rolled away behind her. With every mile that grew between her and Emma's house, her heart felt lighter, though tinged with sorrow. She did not cry, she simply breathed. In that moment, she promised herself silently that she would not return, that she would not allow her life to be tied to a man who could not see the value of care, ambition, and growth. The road stretched ahead, long and winding, but for the first time in months, it felt like a path toward freedom rather than a chain pulling her backward. She leaned against the window, the sun warming her face, and closed her eyes. The journey back to Abuja would be long, but within her, the decision was already made. She would choose peace over pretense, clarity over confusion, and herself over the weight of settling for less. Back in Abuja, Oluchi returned to her routine with the weight of Abaddon still sitting on her chest like a stubborn stone. The city hummed around her, buses honking, traders calling out, office chatter flowing through the air, but her mind was fixed on the silence she had carried home. Emma's calls did not stop, his voice spilled through her phone at odd hours, but each word now felt heavier than before. She answered less frequently, often letting the phone buzz until it stopped, watching the screen fade back to black. When she did pick up, his tone was sharper than usual, his words laced with accusation rather than tenderness. "So because you live in Abuja, you think you are better than me?" he said one night, his voice cutting through the line. Oluchi sat in her chair, staring at the ceiling, her lips pressed into a thin line, refusing to rise to the bait. He spoke of pride, of how city life had corrupted her, of how she looked down on him because he preferred simplicity. She listened quietly, her silence a shield against the storm of his insecurities. When he finally hung up, her chest ached, not with longing but with exhaustion. She knew then that what had once been fragile hope was turning into a burden, one she could no longer carry with grace. Days passed, and her silence became louder than any words she could have spoken. Emma sent messages that alternated between pleading and blaming, sometimes soft as an apology, other times sharp as a knife. Oluchi read them all, but her replies were brief, careful, like someone tiptoeing around broken glass. Then one afternoon, while sitting in her office, a colleague named Yuzo leaned close and whispered something that made her blood run cold. "Be careful with that man," Yuzo said. "You are not the first he has been introduced to. My cousin was once in your shoes." Oluchi's pen froze on the paper in front of her. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief, and Yuzo nodded, lowering her voice further. She explained that Emma had been presented to several women through the same pastor, each story beginning with excitement and ending with disappointment. Each woman had walked away after discovering the same pattern: his unwillingness to change, his refusal to be corrected, his narrow view of life. Oluchi listened, her heart sinking as though stones were tied to it. The revelation was both painful and liberating. It confirmed what her spirit had already suspected. She was not alone in her struggle. She was merely the latest chapter in a book Emma had been writing with the same ink for years. That evening, Oluchi sat by her window, the Abuja skyline stretching into the distance, the lights twinkling like restless stars. She replayed Yuzo's words again and again, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. Emma had made her believe she was special, that his effort to meet her in Lagos, his daily calls, his constant presence, were signs of commitment. Yet now she realized she was only one among many, another woman he hoped would settle into his world without asking him to rise above it. Her thoughts drifted back to Abaddon, the unwashed plates, the careless room, the laughter that masked indifference, and suddenly everything aligned. It was not poverty that troubled her, nor his lack of fashion, nor even his struggles with English. It was his stubborn refusal to grow, his pride in remaining unmoved, his comfort in mediocrity. She whispered to herself, "A man who refuses to climb cannot complain about the view." The words tasted bitter but true. For the first time since December, she allowed herself to cry, not because she still longed for him, but because she mourned the time and energy she had poured into a soil that could never bear fruit. The next morning, when Emma called again, she answered with a calmness that startled even her. His voice was impatient, demanding to know why she had become distant, why she treated him like a stranger. She listened, her silence steady, and when he paused, she spoke gently but firmly. Emma, we are walking on different roads. You want comfort, I want growth. You see correction as insult, I see it as love. You think marriage is an errand, I see it as a covenant. We are not the same. He tried to argue, his words rising, but she cut him off softly. I cannot keep pretending. This is where I stop. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating, and then the line went dead. Oluchi placed her phone on the table, exhaled slowly, and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she felt a strange peace wash over her, like cool rain after a long season of dust. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but she also knew she had chosen wisely. In the quiet of her apartment, with only the city's hum as witness, she whispered to herself, better to walk alone in light than to be led by someone comfortable in darkness. And with that, she began to let go. Not in anger, not in regret, but in quiet acceptance that some stories are never meant to reach the altar. The days after Oluchi ended the call with Emma unfolded like a slow dawn after a storm. She returned to her work in Abuja, her mind clearer, though her heart occasionally trembled with the weight of memory. Colleagues noticed a change in her. Her laughter came easier, her eyes brighter, as though a burden she had carried in silence had finally been laid down. She did not speak much of what had happened, not because she feared judgment, but because the story belonged to her heart alone, and she had no desire to scatter its fragments into careless hands. When she walked the streets of Wuz or rode in taxis through the crowded lanes of Garki, she found herself observing people differently. Couples walking hand in hand, women carrying children on their hips, men bargaining loudly in the market. Life was moving on, and so was she. At night, when the city grew quieter, she sat by her window with a cup of tea, listening to the hum of distant generators, and reflected on how close she had come to tying her future to a man who mistook stubbornness for strength. She was grateful for the clarity, even if it had cost her months of patience, tears shed in secret, and long journeys of hope that led to disappointment. She told herself gently that lessons are not always sweet, but they are always useful, and some of the hardest truths carve out the deepest wisdom. One evening, while attending a friend's small gathering, Oluchi found herself surrounded by laughter, music, and the warmth of familiar voices. For the first time in months, she was not haunted by thoughts of Emma's frown or the silence of his untended home. Instead, she felt free to enjoy the rhythm of life, free to breathe without the weight of compromise pressing on her chest. A friend teased her about being too quiet, and she smiled, shaking her head, saying she was simply enjoying the peace around her. In that moment, she realized that peace was what she had been craving all along, and it was something Emma could never have offered. He had been content with chaos, while she longed for harmony. Later that night, as she walked home under the Abuja moonlight, her sandals brushing against the dusty road, she whispered to herself that she would never again ignore the signs her spirit revealed. She had learned that a relationship without shared vision is like a cart without wheels. It may hold weight, but it cannot move forward. Her steps felt lighter, her breath deeper, as if each stride carried her closer to the life she deserved rather than the life she had almost settled for. Weeks slipped into months, and Emma's presence faded like a voice carried off by the wind. He called less, sent fewer messages, until eventually there was only silence. Oluchi did not chase it, nor did she regret it. Instead, she poured herself into her work, tackling projects with renewed energy, pushing herself to learn, to grow, to embrace the opportunities that came her way. She began saving for a certification course, determined to lift her career beyond its current limits. Friends noticed her determination and admired her quiet strength, though few knew the roots of it lay in the lessons carved by disappointment. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Emma's memory flickered briefly, but it no longer carried pain, only a reminder of what she had escaped. She realized that love without effort is like a song hummed without melody. It may fill the air for a moment, but it leaves no lasting tune in the heart. She smiled at this thought, content in the knowledge that she had not wasted her journey, because even the wrong road had taught her how to recognize the right one when it came. As the year drew to a close, Oluchi stood once again in church, the same place where the story had begun almost 12 months earlier. The December harmattan breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying with it the scent of dust and pine from the makeshift Christmas decorations. She joined in the songs, her voice steady, her spirit free, no longer bound by the weight of uncertainty. When the pastor greeted her after service, asking kindly how she had been, she smiled and answered, "I am well, truly well." She meant it. She no longer carried the quiet ache of doubt, nor the heavy shadow of compromise. She carried instead the gift of clarity, the strength of choosing herself, and the wisdom of knowing that love without growth is a cage disguised as comfort. As she stepped outside, the sun shone brightly over Abuja, warming her skin, and she felt as though the world itself was nodding in approval. She walked away with her head high, her heart open, and her steps firm, ready to embrace the future with courage. The story that had begun with an introduction now ended with liberation, and in its quiet way, it had taught her that sometimes the greatest victories are not in finding love, but in walking away from what pretends to be it. Let this story remind us that not every hand extended toward you is meant to lead you to your destiny. Sometimes what looks like love is only a test of your patience, and what feels like sacrifice is simply a lesson in disguise. Do not be afraid to walk away from what does not honor your spirit. Remember, settling for less will only drain you, but choosing peace will always restore you. Now let us pray. May your heart never be tied to the wrong person. May your eyes be opened early, before your joy is stolen. May you never mistake indifference for love, nor pride for strength. May you be blessed with a partner who values growth, respect, and care. May your home, when it is built, be filled with peace, laughter, and abundance. And may your journey never lead you into confusion, but always into clarity. If you believe this prayer, let your heart shout a loud amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.